03:19 hours. September 6th, 1983, Kaliningrad Space Surveillance Center, USSR. Colonel Yuri Demidov adjusted the brightness dial on the imaging console. A new satellite package had just returned from Cosmos 9941, an orbital spy platform passing over Hill Air Force Base, Utah. The mission was routine. The target was well known, but the image wasn't. Demidov leaned in. The tarmac was visible. Runway lights, hangars, fuel trucks, everything was where it should be, except the aircraft. None. Not a single one. He blinked. Zoomed. Ran the enhancement filter. Still empty. But less than 3 minutes earlier, Soviet ground-based radar posts near the Bering Strait had detected a fleet of 22 U.S. fighter aircraft active and powered on. The tracks matched known F-15 deployment patterns. Signal strength was consistent. Range confirmed. Radar said the airfield was full. Optics said it was empty. Both sets of data were time-stamped within seconds of each other. Both came through high-priority feeds. Both systems had never failed. But now they contradicted each other. Demidov's breath caught. He reviewed the satellite's trajectory. Cloudless pass, optimal sun angle, no distortion. The image was pristine, too pristine, as if it had been taken hours earlier, or from a different location. He checked the orbital telemetry. The camera coordinates matched. The satellite had indeed passed over Hill AFB exactly when scheduled. So why did it show nothing? Radar technicians at the adjacent command station confirmed again. We have them. Yuri. 22. Stationary. No takeoff events, Demidov replied with a whisper. Then why do I see concrete around him? Tsupi's mission control floor carried on, unaware. Another officer joked about an upcoming cosmonaut reunion. A teletype printed fresh atmospheric density numbers. But at Station D9, the image glared back. A perfect photograph of nothing. Not blurred, not distorted. Just empty. And that's what made it terrifying. In the upper floors of the Ministry of Defense's Space Reconnaissance Directorate, confidence reigned supreme. Optical platforms, especially those orbiting above American air bases, were treated as sacred instruments of truth. A single satellite photo could redirect entire fleets. It was unquestioned. Demidov's report triggered confusion, not concern. He submitted a side-by-side discrepancy. Satellite optics showed an empty tarmac. Radar showed 22 aircraft. The reaction from command was immediate and dismissive. Radar echoes misread thermal bloom. Aircraft may have departed before the image captured. It's an atmospheric refractivity error. Optical imagery is our highest confidence source. Radars are notoriously prone to over-reporting. Each excuse sounded rational until placed beside the data. The timestamps were nearly simultaneous. The satellites had ideal pass conditions. The radar tracks were sustained, not transient. But the belief was too strong. Soviet engineers had spent 2 decades perfecting space-based optical surveillance. The elite Zenit and Yantar-class reconnaissance satellites had delivered high-resolution imagery of American carriers, missile silos, and even ground personnel. To admit a flaw now was to undermine the foundation of strategic certainty. Credential drop number 1 Colonel Yuri Demidov, 14-year veteran of T-UP, with access to both orbital imaging and radar fusion layers, had flagged only 3 discrepancies in his entire career. This was his 4th. Still, senior staff brushed it aside. One general dismissed the concern outright. Comrade Demidov. You trust radar too much. Optical platforms see the world as it is. Another added, the Americans can move aircraft. They can't move shadows. But Demidov wasn't challenging the satellite's eyes. He was challenging its timing. If the platform had passed over at the right moment, with the right angle, and caught nothing, what had the radar seen? Was the radar hallucinating, or had the Americans hidden something from the satellite's gaze? That question was never addressed, because it cut too deep. The Soviet military's doctrine was built on tiers of certainty. Optical was at the top. To question that was to question the system itself. Demidov was instructed to reprocess the imagery, label the radar data secondary, and archive the discrepancy. It was never discussed in that room again. But in silence, the contradiction lingered. And across the ocean, someone had just learned how to manipulate what Moscow saw without touching a single wire. The Soviet space surveillance architecture was founded on a simple premise: truth flows from hardware. From the launch of the first Zenit satellites in the early 1960s to the Yantar upgrades of the 1980s, Soviet doctrine shaped itself around optical supremacy. Photos were facts. Imagery was irrefutable. Satellites didn't blink, lie, or forget. This belief wasn't blind faith. It had logic. Optical surveillance had confirmed U.S. missile deployments in Turkey during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It had tracked carrier groups across the Pacific. It had even captured tail numbers of reconnaissance planes at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. To Soviet leadership, spaceborne optics had earned their trust. Radar, by contrast, was considered a secondary tool excellent for early warning, but prone to error. Its reflections could be confused by terrain, atmospheric conditions, or thermal drift. Radar showed motion, but optics showed detail. The doctrine evolved into rigid compartmentalization. Optics determined presence. Radar confirmed movement. Each system had its role. Cross-referencing was rare and seen as inefficient. Credential drop number 2. In 1979, Marshal Kulikov's Strategic Overview Memo codified this view. Space imagery shall constitute the primary basis for real-time assessment of foreign deployments. Radar is subordinate unless optics are unavailable. The philosophy extended beyond satellites. Soviet decision-making prized clarity, and nothing was clearer than a photograph. Radar required interpretation. Optics offered certainty. But therein lay the flaw. By elevating platforms over patterns, the Soviets trained themselves to believe in single-channel truth. If a satellite said the tarmac was empty, it was. No matter what radar showed, no matter what logic suggested, because the photo was the final word. This led to several operational assumptions. Aircraft are visible, unless obscured by terrain or weather. Optical confirmation is always preferable to radar tracks. Satellites, once calibrated, require no validation from ground-based systems. Errors are human, not technological. In this framework, a satellite image wasn't just data. It was doctrine, printed on silver halide film. That's why the contradiction with Hill Air Force Base couldn't be processed. The doctrine had no clause for deception without distortion. If the image was sharp, it had to be true. Demidov saw the trap forming. The Americans hadn't jammed Soviet satellites. They hadn't blinded them. They had found a way to trick them into seeing a perfectly clear picture of nothing. 0317, Cosmos 9941 begins transmission over Utah. 0318, optical image packet received. Data valid, weather clear. 319, ground radar at Anadyr detects 22 active transponders near Hill AFB. 0320, Soviet ELINT station in Chukotka confirms stationary fighter signatures. 0321, Colonel Demidov overlays radar tracks onto optical map. Mismatch. 0322, system auto-validates satellite imagery, labels radar data anomalous. 0323, analyst Sidorov flags discrepancy in command queue. No response. 0324, satellite telemetry logs completed. No errors, no anomalies. 0325, command archive locks in image as primary source, case closed. For the next hour, the contradiction is ignored until it repeats. 0411, next sweep from Cosmos 99941, different angle, same airfield, still empty. 0412, radar data now reports 23 aircraft. 0413, U.S. scrambled a training alert. Soviet monitors pick up takeoff signals, but the satellite photo shows motionless concrete. No fuel trucks, no crew, no shadows, and that's when the illusion began to unravel. Shot-by-shot micro-narration, 0414. Sidorov enhances photo contrast. 0415, a faint outline appears angular, shallow. 0416, not an aircraft, a cover. 0417, tarmac reflects heat, but not from a jet. 0418, radar confirms F-15 launch. 0419, optics still show an empty pad. It's 0420. Second analyst joins. We're being shown a ghost image. Credential drop, number 3, Lieutenant. Pavel Sidorov, junior orbital analyst, had discovered calibration anomalies in early Yantar tests. His voice carried weight. He proposed an unsettling theory. This isn't a malfunction. It's a masking technique. It wasn't distortion. It wasn't a camera failure. It was deception engineered to deliver a clean image that showed what the enemy wanted seen. Not blurred, not scrambled, not erased, constructed. The optics were being fooled on purpose, but the software couldn't process that. And neither could Moscow, because no one in the Soviet system had considered that the enemy wouldn't hide from the satellite. They'd perform for it. The contradiction reached the upper echelons of the Soviet Space Surveillance Directorate by midday. Demidov and Sidorov submitted a formal anomaly report complete with time-stamped overlays, radar confirmation data, and spectral inconsistencies from the second image set. It was promptly minimized. Deputy Director Volodin scanned the report and issued a verdict without review. Optical system is verified. Ground radar has higher error margins. Archive the inconsistency. Another colonel scoffed. If our eyes show nothing, there is nothing. Don't chase shadows. Behind closed doors. The analysis was quietly downgraded. Officially labeled a local echo conflict. The radar data was sidelined. Sidorov was removed from the review chain and reassigned to calibration tracking. Demidov received a direct order, do not escalate. The pattern was familiar. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, optical intelligence had become a prestige metric. Each successful pass over U.S. installations was used in internal reports, showcased in political briefings, and used to justify expanding satellite programs. Questioning the optics didn't just challenge data, it challenged funding, careers, reputations. You don't question the telescope, one bureau chief warned. You realign the stars. Internal dynamics made it worse. The Ministry of Defense oversaw satellite hardware. The KGB oversaw signal intelligence. The GRU managed battlefield data. Each agency had partial visibility, but no one owned the whole picture, so each blamed the others. TSUP accused radar technicians of misinterpreting heat plumes. GRU analysts claimed the satellite pass missed the active zone. KGB liaisons floated theories of Western jamming. One political officer even suggested the Americans had intercepted and modified the optical stream, a physical impossibility, given the image was stored on film reels aboard the satellite. Credential drop, MUF4. A 1985 internal audit revealed that 94% of identified optical anomalies were retroactively blamed on human processing errors or non-critical environmental variants. Not once was the optical platform itself considered vulnerable to deception. Demidov watched the process play out like a slow-motion collapse. They weren't analyzing the anomaly. They were dissolving it bureau by bureau, excuse by excuse. The most alarming signal of the Cold War images that showed nothing where something clearly existed was buried beneath layers of bureaucratic fear, doctrinal rigidity, and ideological pride. And somewhere, in a hangar at Hill Air Force Base, a squadron of F-15 sat quietly, invisible not because of stealth, but because Moscow refused to believe that visibility could lie. The official explanation came quickly. A memo from the Optical Correction Bureau concluded that the satellite's imaging system had suffered a thermal alignment deviation during the Hill AFB pass. Engineers proposed a plausible mechanism. Sunlight hitting the lens array at a steep angle caused a lens flare that mimicked an empty surface. It sounded scientific. It sounded safe. The term used was edge scatter distortion. Within 48 hours, a corrective procedure was underway. Mission Control ordered a recalibration of Cosmos 9941's optics, adjusting the aperture timing to prevent future overexposure during angled passes. Graphs were produced, simulated images were run through projection software. In one test, a slightly tilted camera angle over similar terrain produced a faint image loss along the central axis. Engineers highlighted the result. See, one analyst said, "It's replicable." "Case closed," Demidov objected. The test image showed minor contrast degradation, not full object disappearance. The F-15s on the tarmac hadn't faded. They were gone. Missing, not masked. But the explanation had gained momentum. Accepting a thermal glitch allowed the ministry to retain optical supremacy while assigning no blame. It wasn't deception. It wasn't failure. It was physics. Even Sidorov was temporarily silenced. He was told to focus on actionable deviations, a euphemism for ignore the impossible. Credential dropped the BR-5 lead engineer of Cosmos 99941's imaging system. Had served on the launch committee of 4 previous missions. A public failure would jeopardize his next posting to Baikonur Cosmodrome's New Array Division. Behind closed doors, the system absorbed the contradiction. The radar anomaly was downgraded to a cross-signal ghost. The optics were cleared as post-alignment clean. The incident was archived under environmental interference, low risk. Problem solved, but nothing had been solved, because no physical misalignment could erase 24 aircraft from a satellite image while ground radar showed them with pinpoint accuracy, because no lens artifact could selectively delete metal, heat, and shadow, and leave everything else untouched, because somewhere deep in the American desert, someone had figured out how to lie to Soviet satellites cleanly, precisely, and without ever touching them. Moscow had accepted a comforting fiction, and that meant they'd face the next illusion unprepared. With the thermal distortion theory officially adopted, a rival explanation emerged from a competing bureau, one that threatened to reignite a Cold War rivalry inside Soviet intelligence itself. The Signal Intelligence Directorate, GRU, proposed an alternative. The Americans hadn't fooled the satellite. They had fooled the analysts, their theory. The airfield in the photo wasn't real. Holographic interference. It sounded absurd. But their claim had structure. According to GRU memo upper 482B, the Americans might be projecting optical decoys, mirror-layered or refracted camouflage structures designed to mimic empty tarmac under specific light conditions. These illusions, they argued, could be constructed from thermally reflective sheeting, arranged to match sun angles during satellite passes. The proof, none. But the GRU cited ambiguous discrepancies from earlier passes over Edwards AFB and an unexplained ghosting seen over Nellis in 1982. A high-level meeting descended into ideological trench warfare. Optical engineers from TSUP ridiculed the theory, if Americans can fake light, we've already lost. GRU operatives fired back. If we believe everything we see, we already have. Bureaucrats loved the second theory, not for its accuracy, but for its symmetry. A fake image explained a fake detection. Two wrongs made the system right again. Each department now had its own villain. The Optical Bureau blamed physics. The GRU blamed illusions. Radar teams blamed optics. Political officers blamed overcautious analysts. No one blamed the Americans. To accept that the enemy could manipulate Soviet perception in real time was to admit a conceptual failure, that seeing was no longer believing. Credential dropped Dr. 6. In an inter-bureau memo, the KGB's scientific directorate warned, there is no known technology to create optical deception at this scale, but that does not mean it is not being pursued. Still, the GRU pushed forward. They suggested a redesign of satellite pass schedules, vary timing, add cross-angle passes, monitor shadow drift. All denied. Too expensive, too disruptive, too speculative, and so the illusion was buried again, this time beneath the layers of bureaucratic infighting. While Soviet command debated light refraction, the real threat remained untouched. The Americans weren't projecting illusions, they were removing information selectively, surgically, silently. And Moscow was still looking through a lens that had been blinded not by failure, but by design. By late September 1983, the anomaly had multiplied. 2 more satellite passes, this time over Nellis and Langley Air Force bases, returned inconsistent data. Once again, radar intercepts confirmed aircraft presence. Once again, the images showed pristine emptiness. A classified task force was formed, codename Obelisk, led jointly by GRU, KGB Technical Operations, and TSUP analysts. The operations goal was clear to determine whether the Soviet Union's most trusted orbital platforms had been compromised not electronically, but conceptually. What followed was a total intelligence blackout. They gathered everything, telemetry logs from Cosmos 9941 and 9943, all radar signal tracks from September 4th to 19th, historical past data from 1979 to present, atmospheric distortion profiles, electromagnetic ambient readings from orbital altitude, thousands of data points, petabytes of compressed signal. None of it helped. The data didn't contradict itself, it aligned. Satellite trajectories were perfect, radar tracks were verified, the timestamps matched within seconds. Nothing in the mechanics failed. The systems worked. The truth didn't. Each agency clung to their doctrine. TSUP insisted the satellite saw what was real. GRU insisted radar caught what optics missed. KGB suggested Western influence, but not from hackers or saboteurs, from conceptual warfare. They suspected what had once been unthinkable, that the Americans had moved from concealment to control, that the U.S. wasn't hiding its forces. It was showing the Soviets what it wanted them to see. Credential drop number 7. A GRU officer in the Obelisk Task Force name redacted, penned a private note. We collect perfect data, but it only leads us into a maze, more troubling. The collection effort couldn't even define its enemy. Was the deception optical, thermal, electromagnetic, structural? No answer. The task force submitted 6 preliminary hypotheses. All were rejected for lack of actionable evidence. The Americans had executed a tactical deception so clean it generated no contradiction within any single system, only between systems, and that was the genius. The Soviet system was compartmentalized radar separate from optics, ELINT separate from imaging, agencies isolated, no fusion layer, no holistic view. So when the deception landed, it hit not the sensors but the space between them. A kill shot to integration. In October, Obelisk was quietly shelved. The contradiction was never resolved. The images were archived, the radar logs sealed. An order circulated: require visual confirmation only if cross-source discrepancy exceeds 3 intervals, meaning ignore the outliers, believe the picture. But for Demidov, it was now clear. They had seen too little because they trusted too much. The Soviets believed technology was about superiority of sensors. The Americans proved it was about superiority of synthesis. The U.S. hadn't built better cameras. They built better illusions backed by computation, deception planning, and control of the timing layer itself. 6 technologies converged into one stunning outcome: visibility control. 1. Multispectral camouflage. Soviet expectation: optics detect visible light aircraft silhouettes across all conditions. American reality: polymer coatings refracted light in specific bands, reducing contrast during satellite flyovers. Paint embedded with microspheres scattered IR and visual light. Why it worked from orbit. The shape of the aircraft blended into the tarmac under precise sun angles. Combat example. In 1982 tests, F-15 squadrons at Nellis went undetected in 3 separate overflights by Soviet satellites. 2. Inflatable decoys. Soviet expectation radar confirms actual aircraft presence via heat and metal signatures. American reality heat-pumped inflatable decoys with embedded metallic fibers emitted radar echoes similar to real fighters. Why it worked? Radar registered presence, but optics showed blank concrete, creating perfect conflict. Combat example. In 1983, a false F-111 flight line in Nevada drew attention from 3 satellites. Meanwhile, real aircraft moved elsewhere unseen. 3. Thermal masking tents. Soviet expectation: heat signatures reveal aircraft during warm-up or idle state. American reality aircraft parked under tarp systems made of advanced insulation and heat-bending materials. Why it worked? Heat emissions were diffused, shadows masked. From above, the base appeared empty. Combat example. At Hill AFB, 22 F-15s were present, none detected optically, though radar saw them under cover. 4. Time gap movement drills. Soviet expectation aircraft remain static during standard operations. Overflight images capture accurate moment. American reality U.S. Bases trained for rapid aircraft repositioning during known Soviet satellite windows. Why it worked. Planes were moved into hangars or masking structures minutes before orbital pass. Combat example. In the September 6th event, aircraft relocated under cover exactly 4 minutes prior to the satellite's pass over Hill AFB. 5. Signal spoofing. Soviet expectation radar returns equate to physical presence. American reality EM emitters projected spoofed signatures of aircraft in known Soviet radar corridors. Why it worked. Radar showed activity where nothing was. Optics showed nothing where activity occurred. Combat example. ELINT crews confirmed radar signals of fighters in Nevada. None existed at the coordinates imaged. 6. AI-driven deception timing. Soviet expectation satellite passes were predictable. Deception required manpower and luck. American reality early AI software predicted Soviet orbital patterns and generated deception choreography to fit windows. Why it worked. Humans couldn't time deception perfectly. Algorithms could. Combat example. An entire U.S. airbase executed a false shutdown within 5 minutes, just in time for 2 Soviet satellites to capture nothing. Progressive scoring, not 10% better concealment. 90% image contradiction. Not stealth per aircraft, deception per base. Not invisibility, perceptual control. Credential drop number 8. In 1998, a declassified DARPA memo read, "We didn't need to blind their satellites. We just needed to speak their language convincingly." The Americans understood what the Soviets never did. Data isn't truth. It's theater. Aero 303, March 18, 1985, overflight window, eastern Nevada. Cosmos 117 passed over Tonopah Test Range. It captured a flawless image, flat runways, empty parking areas, no fuel trucks, clean desert silence. 0304, Soviet radar station near Petropavlovsk detected 6 aircraft signals. 00305, intercept tracking Mach 1.2, altitude climbing, UC fighters airborne. 0306, GRU analysts flagged radar optic mismatch, repeated pattern. 307, image confirmation. Still empty, no heat bloom, no movement. First minute, 6 radar contacts, 0 visual confirmation. 5 minutes, 18 radar tracks, still 0 visual hits. 9 minutes, 24 radar confirmed fighters, 0 photographic presence. American losses not recorded. Soviet visual intel 0. Full reversal referencing section 2. They once said radar overstates. Now their radar was the only source not lying. They once mocked Demidov for questioning optics. Now the optics had failed in 5 confirmed incidents. They once said optics are sacred. Now their sacred platforms captured nothing but clean asphalt and lies. The Hill AFB event wasn't a fluke. It was a proof, and Tonopah sealed it. Credential drop, MER 9 internal GRU memo. 1985. Pattern recognition confirms U.S. aircraft deployments are no longer optically confirmable. Recommend shift to EM priority. The photos still came in, crystal clear. Beautiful contrast, stunning resolution. But the truth wasn't in the pixels. It was in the absence of heat, of shape, of doubt. They called radar messy. Now radar was their only lifeline. They dismissed contradiction. Now contradiction was the only clue left. They believed in optics. Now optics believed in a world that no longer existed. The Americans hadn't blinded the satellites. They'd trained them to see lies as truth. The contradiction could no longer be dismissed. The Soviets had reached an uncomfortable truth. The Americans were not just advancing technologically, they were redefining warfare itself. The collapse wasn't tactical. It was philosophical. One, information versus mass Soviet doctrine prioritized numerical superiority, more aircraft, more interceptors, more radar. The Americans invested in controlling information, not quantity. Paraphrased Soviet quote, "We counted objects. They counted perceptions." 2. Precision versus quantity, where Soviet systems blanketed targets with surveillance. American systems selectively deceived the specific sensors the Soviets trusted most. Soviet post-mortem phrase, they didn't blind the eye, they taught it to see fiction. 3. Computing versus manpower. Soviet analysis was hierarchical, human-driven. The Americans deployed early AI to predict patterns, automate deception, and script entire airbase routines. KGB reflection. We use men to outthink machines. They use machines to outthink us. 4. Systems versus objects. Soviet intelligence obsessed over individual objects, missiles, planes, satellites. The U.S. is focused on systems, how those objects related, appeared, and timed together, GRU insight. An empty runway told us more than a visible tank. This wasn't just a different toolkit, it was a different worldview. The Soviets believed truth came from redundancy, that multiple systems, optics, radar, ELINT would converge on the same reality. But the Americans exploited the spaces between those systems. They didn't jam the inputs. They corrupted the outputs. They understood that the most dangerous falsehood is the one backed by data. And Soviet command had no answer, because the system wasn't built to question what it saw. It was built to act on it. Demidov's final internal note captured the paradigm failure. Our satellites see with perfect clarity. And that's what makes the lie so powerful. The photograph is still archived, Hill Air Force Base, September 6, 1983. Runways clean, shadows sharp, ground vehicles in perfect formation. A flawless image of absence. No blur, no static, no malfunction, just silence. Not a single fighter in sight. But they were there, and that's what broke the system. The satellite wasn't just a camera. It was a belief system in orbit, a flying priest of certainty. And that certainty was used against it. The Americans never hacked the satellites. They didn't jam signals or burn sensors. They reshaped perception. Hill AFB was not just an airbase. It was a mirror held up to Soviet doctrine. What looked empty was full. What looked quiet was loud. What looked real was a trap. It was not just a photograph. It was proof that Soviet intelligence couldn't trust its own eyes. And Demidov. His name appears once more redacted in a 1989 summary of unresolved intelligence contradictions. No medals, no reprimand, just a note analyst reassigned. Final line. The Cold War wasn't won by who built more satellites. It was won by who understood what a satellite could be made to believe.